In this section, we cover configuring devices and device drivers and all other installation requirements. We take a deeper dive into drivers, managing packages, and other scenarios that might help you properly install Windows and use it on your platform. When we're thinking about just the different scenarios, we really have to know what tools we're working with. One of those, for example, might be the DISM tool, the Deployment Image and Service Management tool that's packages. So we'll go over each one of these so that you understand what other scenarios you need to consider when you're installing Windows 10. In this section, we really want to focus on things around drivers. What do I need to know to make sure that once I install Windows 10, that the drivers are properly working and I don't have to worry about additional concerns?
Right. There's one thing that we mentioned in an earlier video series about the Upgrade Readiness tool that will allow you to make sure your drivers all work on Windows 10 before you do the upgrade. And there's also, again, if you did a setup.exe and then upgrade scan only, that will also tell you whether your drivers work or not. Now, Windows wants to automatically update drivers. If you have an internet connection, when you run the setup, it wants to connect to Windows Update and update those drivers to the latest version of the drivers. And that's part of what we call dynamic update. So it wants to do that for you already. But you can prevent driver updates over metered connection by using group policy to either prevent driver updates automatically or by marking your connection in your network interface card as a metered connection, and then drivers will not automatically update as long as it is a metered connection. Metered meaning you're paying by the usage of that connection.
We've also included a number of commands. PNP util, plug and play util, is a command that you can actually use to sign your drivers.
Right.
That's also important. So this might be something you might see in the exam. I also know, for driver verification, you might use the SIG file or the verifier itself to validate the drivers that you have running on your platform. So those are other things that you might see on the exam that you want to really kind of think about. And Joe knows as much as I do, the drivers are a big portion of deploying Windows 10.
Oh, absolutely. It's the biggest reason why companies don't migrate as fast as they should, because they're afraid that their custom drivers or their display drivers and stuff like that won't work properly. As a matter of fact, with display drivers, talking about that, display drivers and Bluetooth drivers specifically, I just talked about setup doing a dynamic update of your drivers. It wants to do that, but it doesn't do it with Bluetooth drivers and display drivers.
Absolutely, and we've listed that so that you can actually know exactly how to deal with dynamic updates or display and Bluetooth drivers.
And of course, anything custom that you might have at your company, maybe you created a new piece of hardware and it uses a custom driver. Obviously, that wouldn't upgrade automatically as well. So make sure you understand all that.
And we dive also into post-installation configuration. So this is after I've deployed Windows 10. So everything's running now, Joe. What are we going to do? How do we now further configure our devices to support Windows 10?
Yep, so we talk about when you first get a device and you're going to run through this, what we call OOBE, right? This OOBE setup, OOBE, or out-of-box experience. One of the things it wants to do first is maybe install a provisioning package. So we've talked about that in the other video series. So we're talking now, we've already logged in successfully. Now's when we're going to meet Cortana. We're going to talk about Microsoft Edge and decide, we need to customize some of these applications that come with our current branch for business versions of Windows.
So the first thing we do is meet Cortana. Hello, hey Cortana. And if you haven't yet had a chance to work on Windows 10, which hopefully many of you have, Cortana is your personal assistant, and you hear that quite a bit because what it does is it's integrated with Bing and the search possibilities to be able to find information on your device within, by just configuring it so that you can actually tell it what you need.
And not only that, but what Cortana can also do, we talked about earlier, it can read your calendar and remind you, hey, it's time to go. Because of traffic, it's going to take you this long to get to the airport or to get to your next lunch meeting.
Or it might tell you about calls that you've missed, or give you information on device search history or web search history. So Cortana may be something you get to enable. So if you're doing a initial installation of Windows 10 Enterprise System, it gives you the option to enable Cortana the very first time, if you're doing like a wipe and load or whatever. And also, even if you're doing an upgrade, you get that option. Do you want to turn on Cortana? And the minute you turn it on, it gives you the option to further configure it.
So, hi, what's your name? You put your name in there. It's going to put whatever you want. I think in an earlier screenshot it said Joey Southside, because I am Joey Southside. So you actually saw in one of the earlier screenshots, good morning, Joey Southside.
Exactly. So, and here just gives you an example of how you can actually set it up. Now, once you have those settings configured and you're working, then really you can manage this through group policy, correct?
Yep, Cortana can be managed through group policy. Not completely, but there's a lot of settings that can be managed through group policy. Like a setting that can't be, it doesn't know your name through group policy. You'd have to set that up with your name and whatnot. But most things can be managed right through group policy if you need to. And after Cortana, again, we talked about Client Hyper-V. We've talked about that in the past. So Client Hyper-V, just like the server Hyper-V, allows you to run virtual machines right on your desktop so that you might have a lab environment. I have on my desktop, I have my lab environment running on Hyper-V. And you can see my Hyper-V client is installed. Here's my desktop name. I have a Windows 7 VM, a Windows 10 VM, and several Server 2016 VMs as well. My Windows 10 one is running. And it's right here, right? So I have 2 instances of Windows 10 running on my desktop, one's in a virtual machine.
So when was Hyper-V introduced to Windows?
Windows Client, it was introduced in Windows 8. It got better in Windows 10. And what we can do today, and I don't have this configured today, but what we can do is inside of my VM, I can install Hyper-V and create a VM. So we have nested VM possibilities in Windows 10 Hyper-V, where we didn't have that in the past. And as a matter of fact, even with Hyper-V Server, you need Server 2016 Hyper-V to get that nested VM capabilities.
Exactly. So that's another feature we wanted to mention. The other one we have with Hyper-V that's built in is just the checkpoints. And the checkpoint, again, is very similar to
It used to be called a snapshot.
Right, so you're basically building an image, and then you can actually take a checkpoint, which basically says, at this point in time, this Windows 10 image was configured with these settings, with this configuration, and I want to revert back to that specific checkpoint. So you can have a number of checkpoints. It gets stored in the actual directory, and we've kind of given you sort of a step-by-step on how to actually turn on the Hyper-V Manager and use it for checkpoints.
And one thing that we don't have here is when you create a virtual hard disk to be used in Hyper-V, you can create what we call a parent disk or a differencing disk. For the exam, you want to know the difference between that. And as an example, again, as I go into my Hyper-V, what I've done is I created, and I don't have it here because you don't need the virtual machine settings file for a parent, but I created a Server 2016 parent virtual hard disk. And then when I went to create my DC1, my Server 1, my Server 2, I created a differencing disk off of that. So instead of having 4 different VHDs of 20 gig or more each, I have one that's 20 gig, and then the rest of them are nice and small. They're just differencing disks. So we can do that with Client Hyper-V.
Exactly. So this kind of shows you the details again. Now, the other things that we want you to think about is when you're implementing Windows in an enterprise, the servicing requirements. So we mentioned the WICD tool earlier. Again, that's going to come back up again because that's also important. The key management services, basically making sure that you can actually activate it using Active Directory-based activation, as well as the UAC, the user account control settings in your actual system. Don't forget group policies. Group policies also help you manage it. So these are all of the post-installation things that you need to consider. And we're going to go over a few of those today. WICD provisioning tool, we talked about it earlier.
We talked about WICD in the first series that we did for this exam. As you said before, you can create provisioning packages. You can do basic settings. You can point to that provisioning package during UBI and get a functional provisioned workstation. And
this is important to note because you can either do it as part of a new base image, you can do a wipe and upgrade, and also a in-place upgrade, and then run the provisioning package. Yep. So it's not just a post-installation solution.
That's true, and even through PowerShell or DISM, SCCM, you can push out a provisioning package to existing machines. It's getting easier as Windows 10 matures and gets more features available to it. But that is one of the things that is getting much easier is pushing out that provisioning package.
Exactly, and provisioning packages really come into play because it's a very easy way to add additional configurations. Now, it's not a compliance tool. A compliance tool like SCCM, desired state configuration, will require that your system meet a certain configuration. So the configuration designer sets a set of settings on your device, but it doesn't enforce those settings.
That's true. One of the settings it could do is you could have Windows 10 Professional, and I mentioned earlier in another series that you can take Windows 10 Professional, change the key, and it becomes Enterprise automatically. You can do that with a provisioning package. So we're looking at the Windows 10 activation methods, and we talked about a couple of them already, KMS, Active Directory-based activation. Now, what you need to know for this exam is when would I use a MAC key or a multiple activation key, and when would I use a KMS server? So we have the advantages here on when I would use one or the other. Again, a MAC key, a single activation key, it can be used multiple times. So we have the disadvantages listed there as well. And same thing with KMS. So with the KMS, the key management server is required for a KMS, and it does require activation renewals. So take a look at that and know the difference between when I would use one or the other.
And the big difference now is the activation, Active Directory-based activation, really allows you to configure the activation to happen when a device actually joins the Active Directory infrastructure.
As soon as it joins the domain. That was introduced in Windows Server 2012 R2, Active Directory, the Active Directory-based activation of the desktops, right? So as soon as they join the domain, they can make sure that their Windows is activated.
So you have three options. If you're going to activate Windows 10, you can use a MAC key, multiple activation key. You can use a KMS server and have a KMS configuration set up, or you can integrate that with Active Directory and have it integrated so that when you do join the domain, you can choose, you can have a key assigned to your device. Yep. Now, there's a certain amount of time that you can actually remove the device from the Active Directory environment, which will basically force it to say, I need to check in to make sure that the device is still valid. And after that time, it's going to let you know that you need to reactivate the device.
Now, important to note also for the exam, if it's no longer activated, if it falls out of activation for that scenario, as Alf was just saying, you disjoin it from the domain and a period of time goes by and it's no longer activated, the machine's not going to break. It's not going to brick itself. It's not going to shut down. It's going to shut down periodically, so it's going to be inconvenient to use, is the big thing to note.
Yep. So for the exam, just know that you have three options to choose from. Obviously, the manual one is probably the fourth one, where you actually go in and enter that key, but they really don't test you on whether or not you can manually enter a key or not. The other thing to think about is activation options, where you can actually decide on whether or not you're going to use the KMS activation or just use a basic or a base activation option, where we can have different sorts of activations, retail activations, volume licensing, using a VL key, and just using different commands to actually do the activation.
Right, and you'll see SLMGR VBS file, the VBS script being used a lot for this. You'll see it when we're changing a key for whatever reason. If we have to change a key, again, from Pro to Enterprise, so you have to reactivate if you did that manually, you might have to use an SLMGR. Or to wipe out a key, because you're running a sysprep, so you want to wipe out that activation key. You'll use SLMGR as well. And
you can use SLMGR to actually see what key you have in there.
Right.
And we've put that command in there for you, so you have that as a reference point. And here we talked about the activation, using Active Directory activation. Again, this is a new feature, so don't be surprised if you see it on the exam. It really tests you on that knowledge of understanding how Active Directory activation works. And here's an example of a system that actually has the activation enabled through the Windows 10 activation built into Active Directory.
All right, so we just took a look at, again, the activation methods and some post-installation things like, again, like Cortana and Hyper-V. And now we're going to take a look at user account control. User account control was introduced, how many versions ago? Windows 7?
Yeah,
Windows Vista, right? Windows
Vista, yes.
Introduced UAC, user account control, and it was very restrictive in the Windows Vista days. And that actually was one of the downfalls of Windows Vista, was it was too restrictive.
The interesting here is the reason why, Joe, I looked at Joe, and the irony is that Windows 10 has done a really good job of perfecting, or at least refining how this user account control system worked. When Windows Vista was out, it was probably just as efficient, but people weren't used to having prompts and requests.
It was really restrictive, and most companies just turned it off.
Exactly.
Raise your hand if you turned off UAC in Windows Vista and kept it off in Windows 7, right?
Yeah.
You just did. Windows 10 does a really good job of it. There's things in Windows Vista, in order to create a VPN connection, you needed to to be an administrator, and now you don't, because personally you may need a VPN connection to connect to work. So what we have is some benefits of user account control. Your users don't all need to be administrators. There's the big benefit. They don't need to all be admins, right? Before user account control was enabled, it was too restrictive, so either you turned it off or everyone was an admin. Now you can have it turned on and still prevent the malware. It runs in a secure context, right? So there's still some benefits to running user account control.
Yeah, so know what users need to be able to do and set your policies against that within the user account controls. The intention of the user account controls is to allow users to be able to perform functions on the Windows 10 device based on their level of required access,
right,
and then prevent them from being able to change things that do not need that level, that do not require them to be changed. A good example might be the time on your clock. We had a huge challenge with making sure people could actually change the time on the clock, and UAC actually controls those settings as well.
And a really big one, especially for the exam, is application compatibility. I have an application in Windows 7 that's compatible with Windows 10 as long as you use an administrator. So what do? I do an in-place upgrade, but then the user has to be an administrator. What we can do with user account control, and with, again, we can create a shim of that application to make sure that the application will run with the proper settings without the user being an administrator.
Yep. So know when you need elevation and when elevation is not required. So there are certain features that may be that will require elevation, and there's others that don't. There are, so for example, some of those might be, viewing Windows 10 settings, pairing a Bluetooth device, they don't require that elevation.
Exactly.
But also know that things like, installing and removing applications on the device requires elevation. And if you don't want your users to have that ability, you need to set your UAC accordingly.
Or even just modifying UAC settings. Is UAC enabled?
Exactly.
Enabling BitLocker, disabling BitLocker. Actually, enabling BitLocker is not UAC. Disabling it, I believe, is UAC.
Exactly. And the reason why these settings are here is enterprises really want to protect the integrity of their operating system. They want to make sure that the systems do not become compromised. And the user account control settings really give them that power, the IT administrative control back, and allow them to further protect what users are doing on those devices.
It's funny and almost ironic that Windows 10 is the most secure operating system, and it really is. I know I sound like a salesman, not an exam prep trainer, but it's the most secure operating system, and one of the reasons for that is because UAC became less restrictive, right? We are now allowing standard users to do more, so Windows 10 is more secure. And the irony there is because before a user had to be an admin to pair a Bluetooth device. It had to be an admin to create a VPN connection. So once they're an admin, right? So now they don't have to be an admin to do those simple, not simple, but those tasks.
Again, post-installation requirements, this is one of those that we wanted to make sure that we mentioned to you. User account controls, but as well, group policies. And if you've ever worked in this platform, group policies are really what drive the consistency of controls on those devices. And as you're preparing for the exam, make sure that you're familiar with what group policies are, how they work, when you can use them, and what's new when it comes to Windows 10.
Now, what's new with Windows 10, obviously there's not just 4 new policies with Windows 10 from Windows 7. There's actually hundreds, probably. So make sure you know what they are. We've listed a few of them here. Start screen and start menu improvements, management. One of those things you can do with Windows 10 Enterprise, you can force specific tiles on a specific portion of the start screen to all of your users, and that was never possible before. It's actually only possible in Windows 10 Enterprise Edition to force that out to all of your users. So take a look at some of these settings. There's a lot of them. One thing I also want to mention with group policy, you can see from my own machine, I just opened up a Microsoft Management Console. And one thing I can do with group policy on my Windows 10 machine is I can add remove snap-in, and I can add group policy object editor, add to my local machine, finish, and then I can add another one that is going to go, it's going to pertain to my non-admin users, finish, and yet one more that's going to pertain to my admin users. Okay, and now if we're talking about group policy. Now we're talking about group policy in an enterprise, but even on a local machine, maybe that's not connected to your domain, it's a kiosk machine or it's sitting in a guest cube, we can now create these different policy settings like we could in the enterprise, even ones that pertain only to non-admin policy user config and admin policy user config. So this is all part of group policy with Windows 10 as well.
So as a Windows 10 administrator, as an IT administrator, one of the other things you have to be familiar with in the enterprise is managing objects in Active Directory. So Active Directory terms are things that you should be fairly familiar with. OUs, sites and subnets, domain trees, organizational units, global catalog servers, all are terms that are used when you're managing those devices in your Active Directory environment. Now, there's quite a bit of organizations that have Active Directory, so do expect this to be questions that you are challenged on in
Absolutely,
the exam.
because we're talking about group policy, right? And group policy can be linked at the site, it can be linked at the domain, it can be linked at the organizational unit, and you'll get different policies based on where it is and how many policies there are and where it's linked. So you do need to know these terms for this exam.
So we've shown that to you as well. Again, very important. So we're going to start off and talk about just a practice question that you might get in this scenario. So you are planning your company's user account control policies and need to provide the security team with a list of actions which do not require UAC. Which of the following actions do not require UAC? And we'll ask you to select three.
Yep. Select three, and this might be click them from the left to the right, it just might be select three. It almost never will say select all that apply. They don't do that on questions any longer. As of today, they don't do it on questions any longer. I don't know that they never will. So it will say select the three. In this case, we had a slide earlier that mentioned some of these. So installing Windows updates, configuring Windows update settings, installing a device from a USB drive, pairing a Bluetooth microphone. So in this case, we've already seen installing Windows updates, pairing a Bluetooth device, and then our accessibility options would be the answers here.
And so that really covers much of what we wanted to talk about from a module standpoint. So a couple things you want to keep in mind. Tip number one is make sure you're thinking about user state migration tools, because that's also very important. How you're going to upgrade your operating system, what you're going to use, whether you're going to restore the data, whether you're going to deal with BIOS or UEFI. Tip number two is make sure you know how you're activating the device. Are you using an Active Directory-based activation model, KMS, or MAC key? And tip number three is make sure that you're know exactly where you're going from. If you're going from a 32-bit operating system to a64, whether you want to do something like a wipe and load.
And you see there we have in tip number three, as of today, the exam does not include Anniversary Edition or Creators Update. As we said, things are moving quickly, and the exams are actually, we joke around about things what we call exam as a service, and this exam is being updated probably every 6 months or so. So by the time you take this exam, it very well may have Anniversary Update or even Creators Edition versions of group policy available.
So we've done our best to make sure we cover as much content as possible for Module 1. Lastly, considering all of the requirements that are needed for actually post-configuration. So we hope this is helpful for you as you prepare for the exam, and we'll see you in the next module.